Thank you so much, Jane. It's a delight and an honour to be in conversation today with dear Fiona McFarlane about her spectacular new novel, The Sun Walks Down. I've read this novel twice now, and my admiration just keeps bigging. It offers an original revisioning of an iconic story. It handles a complex narrative structure superbly. It portrays the daily life of a 19th century outback community in painterly detail, and it imagines an array of diverse characters with astonishing intensity. It addresses the large and contested subject of Australian history directly and wisely, representing and representing the past with a richness and profundity that is wholly distinctive. It achieves all this lightly, without didacticism, without renouncing humour and generosity, and it does it in glorious prose. Here are some of the adjectives that writers have used to describe Fiona's novel: brilliant, magnificent, assured, majestic, symphonic, extraordinary. The best word came from the writer and scholar Bernadette Brennan, who called it phenomenal. I know that we'll all remember this evening, always, as marking the moment when a classic of Australian literature arrived in the world. Fiona is uncomfortable with the G word, so I won't call her a genius. Let's settle for goddess instead. Goddess Fiona, massive congratulations on your phenomenal novel. Would you start our conversation by reading from it, please?
Thank you, Michelle. I would love to, but first I just wanted to say a couple of words because it's so rare and wonderful to be in the same room as so many people who are in the acknowledgements of this book. So I just want to say thank you to a few people. First of all, to Jane for being so incandescent and for loving and believing in the book from the very beginning. Ali, the Alan and Unwin publicist, who has made touring bookshops just an absolute delight, although has threatened my life in traffic a number of times today. I want to thank Michelle, who has listened to me talk and fret about this novel for many years over breakfast at the General in Dulwich Hill, and has been a supporter of it for so long, and whose existence as a writer of great brilliance is such a source of courage and joy to me and every other writer I've ever met. I want to thank my dear friend Prue, who, aside from being just wonderful and fabulous in every possible way, let me steal her family name and apply it to a family that bears absolutely no relation. I promise, to Prue's own, but the accents of my novel owe Prue an enormous debt. I want to thank Jack Ellis, who, aside from being just a magnificent human being, was my consultant on cricket and boxing in this. And if you know me, which almost all of you do, you'll know that I know absolutely nothing about cricket and boxing, and I could not have had a greater teacher. Thank you, Jack. And then lastly, I want to thank my family, my mum and dad, who took me to the Flinders Ranges in the first place. This book wouldn't exist without them. And I also want to thank my dear sister Katrina, who the book is dedicated to, who knows a lot more about Welsh swagmen than she ever imagined she would, because she became a de facto research assistant in the course of writing the novel. So thank you so much to all of those people, but also just to everyone who has come along today to celebrate this with me. It's particularly lovely to see my students here because they've also heard me talk about this novel for a long time, and they fill me with joy and encouragement for the future of Australian literature. Okay, so now that I've done that, thank you for your patience, everybody. I am going to read from the very, very beginning of the book. I wonder if I might try and do it without the microphone. How does that sound? Can you hear me up the back? Okay, good. Okay. This is sort of a prologue opening to the book, and it lets you know right away that this is set in the colony of South Australia, September 1883. The boy met a god by the hollow tree. "Go away," said the boy, and the god, formless, passed on in the direction of the red hill. Then the boy was free to hunt in the scrub for roosting hens. When he came upon the hens, they flapped up as if they could fly, and he gathered their eggs in a basket. The boy was 6 years old and thin, with a vivid, pointed face. He wasn't pale exactly, his skin browned in the sun, but the visible veins at his wrists and ears suggested a delicacy that the people he knew associated with pale children. There was so little of him. When his mother held him, his heart felt near. Light hair lifting in the briefest wind, and not so delicate, in fact. A strong boy, a good runner. The name people called him was Denny, and he answered to it. The boy was gentle as he settled the eggs in the basket. Then his mother wanted him close. He knew this, even though she hadn't called his name. Nobody had ever told him about his mother's deafness. She was simply his mother, which meant she heard little and spoke less. But the boy knew when she wanted him to go to her. She had finished hanging the sheets on the line behind the house, and the boy went to give her the basket of eggs. She took it, bent down to him, and pressed her face against his neck. Today she belonged to him entirely. All his sisters were at a wedding in town, and his father was out planting parsnips. The boy and his mam were alone and loving among the sheets. Then, quick as a blink, she straightened, turned her back, and went into the house, which always ate her up. The boy, following, wanted to help her churn the butter, but she made him put his boots on, she laced them tight, and she sent him out with a sack to gather grass and bark and twigs. He liked to collect things for the fire, and he liked to please her. The black dog Mopsy woke from her nap in the sun and looked as if she might come with him, but she heard Mam start the butter churn and went to supervise that instead. The boy walked away from the red hill, although it was from behind the hill that his sisters would come home from town. The country he walked into was red and brown, desert country, but there was a haze of green over the top of it, because it was spring. At this time of day, the surrounding hills were white and yellow and green. A shrub scratched the boy's shin, and he followed for a while the deep course of a dry creek. He kneeled on its stony bed and saw ants carrying a large dead fly. The word that came to him was housebound, maybe because he'd heard his mother use that word about Mrs. Balmain, who had large eyes like a fly and clean folded hands, and sat in a chair with wheels on it as if she had neat grey wings tucked behind her. But the boy didn't think of Mrs. Balmain exactly. The word housebound just dropped into the boy and went away again. He rounded a curve in the creek and surprised a kangaroo. He knew the story of the kangaroo. Once upon a time, it argued about food with its cousin, the wallaroo, so now it stayed here on the dry, flat plain, while the wallaroo lived up in the hills. The boy's heart was big with sorrow for the kangaroo, which crouched very still and looked at him. It seemed to be waiting for something to happen. Then it turned and flew from the creek bed, and the boy climbed out to follow it for its dung, which also burned. Really, he followed it because it was fast, because the boy was also waiting for something to happen, because he was 6 years old. Soon, things would happen. Men would call his name in the night. There would be blood on a handkerchief and fire on the red hill. The boy looked north and saw a high, dark wall over the ranges. The wall was moving towards him. It was made of dust, and when the dust reached him, it hid the sun. The sun was there. The boy could see it through his narrowed eyes, but it was brown now and silly, and only as bright as a lamp or the moon. The dust rolled down from the north in secret colours, very soft, until the wind came up behind it. Then it stung. The boy held the sack across his face, as his father had taught him to do when the dust storms came, and he turned around and began to walk, and that's how he got lost, trying to walk home in the dust. When the storm had passed, his mother went out into the yard and spat red onto the red ground. She looked for him in the direction he had gone and saw no sign.
Thank you. Let's begin with Denny, begin with The Lost Child, which is an iconic figure in Australian history, myth, imagination. Why did you want to revisit that iconic story?
Well, for various reasons, I found myself writing a 19th century outback novel, and I thought if I'm going to tackle Australian history, then I might also tackle this other enormous narrative that has shaped our culture over the last couple of hundred years. We see the lost child in film and in art and in literature, and one of the things, and I'm sure we'll talk about the wonderful landscape of the Flinders Ranges, one of the things that struck me when I first visited was the cemeteries you see, the graveyards you see, and the number of children's graves that were present. And I became fascinated by the stories of children who had, in the late 19th century, gone missing and become kind of mythological figures in Australia. So in the 1880s, when the book is set, there were two very, very famous cases of this. One of them, a group of children who survived, one of them, a group of children who didn't. And they were incredibly sentimentalized, and the whole way in which the Australian landscape was characterized by settlers thinking about children lost in the wilderness was as sinister and threatening, and very, very much framed from the point of view of outsiders who were trying to make sense of a place that they had invaded and expected to be as much like England as possible, and it turned out that it wasn't. So I was so interested in the idea of the lost child narrative as a kind of anxiety, as a manifestation of a cultural anxiety that we as a nation have had about arriving here, misunderstanding the land, mistreating the land, and the complexity of this country that we sort of blundered over and got deeply confused about was really fascinating to me. And also, I thought, well, I think perhaps the worst possible thing would be to have your child go missing.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to explore that emotionally as well. And I wanted to spend some time with a family who were dealing with that. So it was sort of an intellectual exercise on the one hand, and then also an emotional exploration of what that might be like for a family.
Yeah, and it also draws the reader in straight away and keeps you going.
Good.
So you mentioned, seeing the graves of children, cemeteries, and you also talked in something you wrote about the book about seeing the ruins of towns, former settlements in the South Australian outback, and you said that it made you realise that, really brought home to you, that Australian colonial history is a series of unsettlements, which is a beautiful phrase. Can you just unpack that a bit more, and also talk about what bearing it has on the book?
Sure. Well, I first visited the Flinders after going to Adelaide Writers' Week with my first novel, and I was so struck by the extraordinary beauty of the landscape, and geologically it's deeply interesting. The history of it is also fascinating, and one of the things that really struck me was that as you drive through the Flinders, there are colonial ruins everywhere, from single chimneys sort of standing in the middle of a paddock, a church that just appears out of nowhere, or entire towns, entire ghost towns. And it almost feels like a ghost desert, the entire place. And I feel as if the the writing antenna just goes up as soon as you see this kind of thing. Who were these people who lived here and don't live here anymore? Who were these people who came and abandoned these 19th century houses? So I started looking into the sad history of people who believed that if they ploughed land in the desert, it would rain. That was a true belief that people had. And they went north of what's called Goyder's Line in South Australia, where they were told it wouldn't rain and they couldn't possibly grow wheat. And they did it anyway. And they tried to exist in this arid landscape in basically English villages, English agricultural villages. And the word that kept coming to me as I was experiencing this landscape was, this is deeply unsettling. And I didn't mean it to be a kind of deeply clever pun. I guess that just comes naturally. But it began to occur to me, that it was interesting to think about the history of Australia not as sort of this grand project of settlement, but in fact, initially, an invasion that was an unsettling of the original inhabitants of the country, and then also as a kind of failed project, at least specifically in the Flinders. So I became interested in exploring the ways in which settlement had been disrupted by different forces, many of them human folly. And that felt to me like an interesting way to approach Australian history, because it's not necessarily the story that we are taught in school or that we sort of think of when we cast our minds back to colonial Australia.
Yeah, indeed. When you talk about the history and the invasion, we think, of course, of Indigenous Australia, and I think that this book just weaves beautifully and respectfully all kinds of Indigenous knowledge and story into its narrative, and also draws us beautifully into the lives of its Indigenous characters. But this is contested ground in Australian literature. There are writers, Indigenous writers and others, who believe that the rest of us should stay away from writing from an Indigenous perspective, while others feel it's not problematic. And I'm thinking specifically here of Billy Ruff, the farmhand who works with Denny's father. What made you decide that you wanted to go there? And how did you go about doing that?
Thank you for asking that. When I thought about writing a 19th century outback novel, I felt initially that there might only be two options available to me when I thought about the representation of the Nakana and Adjinamutna people who lived in this area. And one of them was to be terribly frightened and write nothing about them at all, which seemed like absolutely the wrong approach. It seemed disingenuous at best and insulting at worst. The other option was to do such an amazing job that no one could possibly fault me. And fortunately, I felt very humble about that possibility from the very beginning. So I thought that what I might do was to make the book be in part about this question: who gets to tell stories, what's the consequence of those stories, and who suffers for them. So the book is full of artists who do more and less nefarious things in the name of their art. So there are larger questions around appropriation and around the way in which Australian literature has been culpable in shaping certain narratives. So the Australian writer in the novel is a kind of unpleasant policeman. So that's very deliberate. So that feels like the the sort of intellectual and literary way that I thought about tackling these questions. I don't think we can ignore them. I don't have answers to them.
No.
I'm very open to the conversation. I think it's a really important one to have. So I wanted the book to enter into that conversation without pretending it didn't exist and without pretending it knew the answer. And then in terms of the actual representation itself, I certainly didn't undertake that lightly. There was an enormous amount of research and consultation, and the only point of view character who is Yadliawada man is a man who has been sort of adopted by an eccentric landowner who collects what he considers oddities and wonders because Billy turns out to be really, really good at cricket. And so he is adopted into this man's sort of complicated cabinet of wonders very, very early on, and is quite distanced from his traditional culture. And that was as close as I felt that I could come as a white writer to think about the deep interiority of an Indigenous person. And that was a very, very deliberate decision, and undertaken with, I hope, humility and respect. And I hope that all of that sort of makes a kind of sense within the larger questions that the book is asking about who gets to make art and why that matters, and who that might hurt.
Yeah, I think you do beautifully.
Thanks.
And sort of use what is clearly an immense amount of research really lightly and superbly. But since we're thinking about characters, I mean, one of the really sort of astonishing and wonderful things about this book is the sheer number of main characters. I think we got to 14 at the last count. And I mean, I love the sort of evenness of your tension that goes across all these various, very different characters, all of them superbly realized. And it seemed to me, in some ways, I love this elevation of the collective over the individual. But I did wonder, why did you decide to go for an ensemble novel?
Yes, especially because my first novel had 2.5 characters in it.
And the cats.
You're right, 4.5 characters. It's really important to me from the very beginning, as soon as I started conceiving of this novel, that I not come into it claiming to have access to one overarching narrative that said, this is what the past is, this is what you should pay attention to, this is how everybody felt. I wanted to explore the kind of messiness and noisiness and the contradictions of the ways in which all of these different people were experiencing these events and experiencing this place. I have a kind of suspicion sometimes about a certain kind of realist historical novel that presents a beautiful smooth surface that purports to recreate things exactly as they were. And I wanted to write a novel that you became immersed in, you were really compelled by the characters, there was a sense of vivid aliveness to them, but instead of kind of taking a bow and saying, here is a smooth and accomplished historical novel and now I'm going to shuffle away, I wanted it to kind of stand up and say, actually, this isn't so smooth after all. This is a construction, absolutely. It is an act of imagination. The book is, as well as the various point of view characters, it's interrupted between chapters by these people who just kind of arrive, who have very little to do with the rest of the novel, but insist on having their say about events and about the town. So I wanted to explore all the ways in which our history is more multicultural than we think. I mean, one of the greatest joys of researching it was learning about the Afghan Cameleers in South Australia in the 19th century who opened up the interior and who we all owe an enormous debt to, and yet I never heard anything about them in school. So thinking about all of the ways in which 19th century Australia was more complicated and noisier than we might imagine, and exploring some of that complication and noise was really important to me.
Yeah, it's a novel that I think on the one hand does this very clever thing, because it dips its lid to the 19th century realist novel, while at the same time very smoothly, kind of tunneling away at its certainties. So I think you do great things with form as well as content in this book. So let's go back to characters, though. And one of the very striking characters is the Swedish landscape painter, Karl Rapp, and his wife, English wife, Bess, who is also an artist, perhaps a less flamboyant one. What is Karl doing in this book?
What is this handsome Swede doing in outback Australia? Well, one of the things I knew I really wanted to explore was different experiences of this landscape, and especially because I think there are so many ways in which settlers characterize the landscape as threatening or as sinister. Or artists arrived in Australia and said everything is grey. This is ugly. We can't paint this. So one of the things that I wanted to do was throw a reluctant European landscape painter into this environment. He's sort of been bossed into the situation by his much more practical wife, and I wanted him to have to confront and think about this place. And whether or not he actually manages to do that is a complicated question. One of the things that's happening over the course of the novel is that the sunsets have suddenly become extremely vivid and bright and strange, and Karl believes that is only happening here in this one particular place, and it's happening because he is there and he is required to record this sky. And so he becomes obsessed with painting the sunset. And whether we discover later on in the novel whether or not these sunsets are particular to Karl in any way. But so he's there to sort of grapple as an artist who has, I think, vaguely good intentions, but has no real understanding of what he's looking at. And he's being asked to interpret that artistically, or he's asked himself to do that. And his wife has also asked him because she really needs him to earn some money. So, he's one of the artists of the book who I have an enormous fondness for, but who is there in part so that we can think about what it means to try and recreate something that we see in the world, and think about whether or not that's possible and what success of that kind might look like.
I have to say that the kind of vision of art that you come away with is not encouraging, really. So there is, as you mentioned, Sergeant Foster, the awful police. Well, he might be a good policeman. I think he's probably not, but he's a terrible writer, and he writes these books with titles like Forging the Way, or sort of very nationalistic, bombastic, and convinced of his own genius. And then he's fairly this is not a rosy view of, Australian historiography. And then there is Bess, Carl's wife, who's a much more sympathetic character, but who makes a really quite terrible decision, or very ethically fraught decision, let's say, at one point for the sake of her art. Do you think that art is selfish? There's something selfish about the pursuit of...
One of the things that has really struck me is that so many readers of the book call the artists self-centered narcissists. and part of me thinks, okay, yes, that's what I intended, and part of me is like, no, be nice to them. They're just trying to make things. It's really hard to make things. So I feel as if I may have been harder on these artists than I intended to. I mean, Foster the policeman is sort of a manifestation of a generation of anthropological policemen who were roaming around the interior in the 19th century, involved in the frontier wars and simultaneously recording the traditions of the nations that they were decimating. So while they were participating in wiping out Aboriginal people, they also became the only record that we have of some of those nations or aspects of the nations. And so he definitely comes from a nefarious and problematic inheritance that Australian historiography has to sort of has to account for. Whereas I think Bess and Carl are in some ways doing their best. I wanted the book to be interested in art and why we do it, but I wanted it to also reaffirm, I don't know, not to say yes, art is worthwhile, because to me art feels inevitable. There's no way we won't make art. I know that this audience is full of my creative writing students who are going to keep writing no matter what. Unfortunately for them, that's their fate. So I think the book treats art as an inevitability, and perhaps asks that we really think about the responsibility involved in creating art, but it doesn't want anyone to stop doing it.
Good.
I
want to ask a sort of rightly question, which is, why did you write it in the present tense?
I didn't, to begin with. It started in the past tense, and then it just came. It sort of occurred to me that it needed to be in the present. And once I started doing that, I noticed that there is a bit of a trend for historical fiction to be written in the present tense, because people claim that the present tense is more vivid, it's more immediate, etc. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think you can make the past tense vivid and immediate. You can make third person and first person vivid and immediate. There's just different tools that we have at our disposal. But I did want us to be in that present moment with these people. One of the things that was important to me was that I try and enter into a 19th century that had no understanding of what was to come. So even though I think the book is very 21st century and is clearly interested in conversations that are very contemporary, I didn't want my characters to know that. So I remember watching The Tudors, that TV show long ago, and every episode Henry VIII would be happened to be composing Greensleeves, or the Pope happened to be signing a declaration to say that slavery was now outlawed. And I didn't want a history that was a novel that was burdened by future knowledge of what would matter to us. And the present tense was one way of exploring that.
I know exactly what you mean. Yes, that promising young deputy, Robespierre.
Yes. And there was also Sir Thomas More saying, in the future, all women will be educated, and the person he was talking to is saying, don't be ridiculous.
I know. I mean, well, I thought actually that it's kind of connected to that, that there was this wish on your part to avoid exactly that kind of presentism, and also to link it to that beautiful Ujuru epigraph that you use. Now is such a small...
Now is so small a part of
smaller
time.
part of time. A great line. So, you know, it kind of... that line refers to the now of the characters, obviously, but also to our now. And I thought it was a really... using the present tense was one way of sort of collapsing our superiority towards, you know, our awful tendency to think that we know more than anyone who has ever lived before us. Like sort of historical teenagers, aren't we? We know everything.
Yes, that's perfect.
So I'm going to open up the conversation to everyone else in a minute, but I just also want to ask, I mean, it's a very complicated structure, Fiona. Did you write it in the order in which we're reading it? No. Tell us about that and how you kept track of it all.
I had many pieces of paper stuck on walls. One of the things I decided early on was that it would take place over 1 week, and each chapter would be a day or a night in the week. And I'm sure I talked about this to my students, how deeply useful it is to make a formal decision like that at the beginning of a novel, especially one that involves a lot of characters, because you sort of have given yourself a shape in which to pour the rest of the book. So that gave me a kind of freedom to jump around chronologically as I was writing. There were certainly characters who insisted upon their parts in a non-linear fashion, and it was a novel that I couldn't write the end until I had written everything else. I couldn't think about how all of these people sort of, I mean, not tied up together at the end, but how all of the pieces kind of fit together until I had explored what each of their weeks looks like. So I did, I mean, the first line is the first line that I wrote, the very first sentence that I wrote of the book, and then I did write the end last, and then in between it was a free-for-all.
Okay, well, let's turn it over to you and a free-for-all, we hope. Any questions for Fiona? Susan?
Fiona, I can't wait to read this book. Were you writing it here or in America, or both? I just want to know, and how did that affect your thinking about your subject, where you were?
I've just got to repeat that for the...
Yes.
Yes, so Fiona, were you writing the book here or in America, and how did that affect you?
I started it here and spent... I mean, I was when I started, I was still working on The High Places, so I was finishing that book, and I started thinking about this one, and then I started writing it here, and then I moved to California in 2019, and the book wasn't yet finished, and a lot of people have asked what was it like to write about the Flinders in California, and I would say that I didn't exactly move to California. I moved to the plague. I moved right before the pandemic and was under really strict lockdown for 18 months, teaching online, and couldn't leave the house, friends couldn't visit. So it was a sort of intense time, in some ways a gift to a writer, because there's absolutely nothing else to do. So I was able to finish the book that way. But I think just mental health wise, in fact, the ability to disappear into the Flinders in that time and to spend time at home when I couldn't come here was part of was part of the experience of writing it and of inhabiting the landscape that was really important to me. So it's really hard for me to imagine not having it finished it in that exact context. But I'm not sure that I was in California. I was just in my house. I was in my brain, and these characters were company, and this place was a way of traveling home. Yeah.
More questions? Come on.
Am I allowed to follow up? Only if there's someone else.
I think there is someone just behind you.
I haven't read the book, but you spoke about 14 different characters. Just wondering if you had a special affinity with one over the other, or if there's something, you've spoken of a couple there already, but if there's others there that you had a special relationship with.
Did you have a special affinity for any one or two of the characters?
I did. There's a very bossy girl called Sissy in the novel who may or may not be based on my adolescence. My mother is chuckling.
I loved Sissy.
Thank you. I'm not sure how my mum felt. And then actually one of the characters I really enjoyed writing is one who never actually appears in the novel, was already dead when the novel begins, but he is based on an actual man called Hugh Proby, who is the fifth son of an earl, so kind of the belated son of an earl who had nothing else to do and came to Australia and set up a pastoral station in the Flinders, and then sort of died spectacularly while trying to cross a river in flood on horseback. And if you go to the Flinders, you see these signs that just say Hugh Proby's grave just everywhere, and we followed these signs and found this enormous slab of marble which his sisters sent over from England, and it took nearly a year for it to get from Adelaide to this lonely place in which it's been sort of sitting ever since. And I felt this. I mean, he's the sort of character. He was the fifth son, and the other four sons all ended up dying. And if he hadn't come to Australia, he would have been the Earl. And I feel like it's the kind of thing. I mean, that's not in the book, but it's the kind of thing that if I put it in the book, you'd say that's ridiculous. So I have a fondness for him. He's quite a silly man. My version, which is not actually Hugh Proby at all, but. So I think there are little parts about almost everyone that I have affections for.
Susan, maybe you'll follow up.
Don't sit greedy, but just thinking about you writing in COVID, but I'm wondering about your research, which you've obviously done a great deal of. Did you ever, did you go back to the Flinders at all after that initial trip? Did you do on the ground? Were you in libraries? Were you online? Probably a bit of all. But I just wondered how much you did stick to reality and how much your Flinders ranges is of your imagination. So,
how did you go about your research? What forms did your research take, and how much is real and how much is imaginary?
Well, I took the novelist's prerogative of inventing a town, but it is it and the pastoral station outside of it. So the town in my novel is called Fairley, and the station outside of it is called Thalassa. And they are based on a real town and a real ruined station in the Flinders. So I took that as a sort of foundation. I visited the Flinders 3 times overall. I would have gone more, except for COVID. So that's a sadness to me that I didn't get to go back again. I spent time in the archives at the State Library of South Australia. One of the most incredible resources that we have as writers is the National Library of Australia's Trove website and all of the newspapers and journals, etc., that are available. So there I was in California looking up things like how do you kill a bullock and finding all these wonderful things in troves. So, and then I had an enormous number of books. One of my students mentioned earlier that I had showed them, we had been talking about researching a novel, and I showed the bookshelf of books about 19th century Australia that I amassed, and that all came to California with me. So it was a combination of many things. I think the archival stuff is particularly enjoyable because it's a lot of letters, or it's the diaries of a policeman's wife, or someone saying, "Sinister Tom arrived today." Who is Sinister Tom? So that sort of stuff is enormously fun. But also there are books by Adnyamatna people, which is the main nation of the area that I was sort of writing about, or sort of imprinted upon, that were enormously helpful. A lot of scholars who have done wonderful work about the Flinders already. So there was a wealth of stuff. I did know a lot at one point about growing wheat in the 19th century, which I've forgotten completely now. But I made sure to, as I did all this research, to be writing at the same time. So it was never a sense of, I've got to read everything and then I get to write a book. It was a tandem thing.
One last question at the back. Sorry, that hand was up first.
Fiona, I'm one of the lucky people who have had a chance to read this book, which is extraordinary. So I know where the title comes from, but I'm wondering if you'd like to talk about it.
Could you talk about the title, please?
Sure. The title comes from the handsome Swede I mentioned earlier. So The Sun Walks Down is a literal translation of the word for sun, one of the words for sunset in Swedish. So the novel is sort of organised around these sunsets that happen. For Carl, that the activity involved in the word is really important. And then I also have, conveniently, a very dear best friend who's good at titling my books. So this was on a list of possibilities, and she chose it. So a combination of those things.
Okay, I think we are really going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid. Fiona will be signing copies of her book out there, and I really think you need not just one copy but 2 copies of this book, because Christmas is coming, so be prepared this year. And first, let's before we get ready for Christmas, let's please all congratulate Fiona and thank her very much.